If you enjoy wild real-life revenge stories like this, make sure to stick around until the end and don't forget to hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss the next unbelievable tale. Now let me tell you about the time my HOA's self-proclaimed enforcer, a woman we'll call Karen, decided she had the right to remove my garden while I was away, only to be blindsided when she got hit with a state fine in the mail that completely backfired on her plans. And trust me, this story has more twists than a roller coaster because it all started when I bought my first home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, excited to finally have a piece of land I could call my own after years of saving, dreaming of a beautiful vegetable and flower garden in the backyard as a way to connect with nature, reduce grocery costs, and have something peaceful to come home to after work. And I worked hard on that garden, putting in raised beds, planting heirloom tomatoes, cucumbers, herbs, and also lining the space with pollinator-friendly flowers that the local bees and butterflies loved, spending hours after work with gloves and watering can in hand, enjoying how it was turning into a lush paradise. But in almost every neighborhood there's always that one person who takes it upon themselves to police everyone else, and ours was a middle-aged woman named Karen who had somehow made herself the self-appointed voice of the HOA board even though she wasn't the president or even on an official committee anymore. She just carried a clipboard, strutted around like she owned the place, and constantly issued warnings for petty nonsense like someone's grass being half an inch too tall, or a trash bin being visible for 10 minutes too long after pickup day. So when she first made a passive-aggressive comment about how my garden looked like a farm, not a yard, I just brushed it off, thinking she was being her usual nosy self. But then she started ramping things up, first leaving anonymous notes about violations that didn't actually exist in the bylaws, then cornering me in the driveway to say vegetables weren't allowed in front-facing yards, even though my garden was in the back, and I even went so far as to print out the HOA's own rules showing that vegetable gardens were perfectly allowed as long as they were maintained. But she didn't like being corrected and muttered something about how aesthetic matters more than technicalities, which should have been my first warning that she was planning something bigger. But life got busy. Work demanded a lot of travel from me, and one week I had to fly out for a 10-day trip, making sure beforehand to arrange with my neighbor, a kind retired teacher named Mrs. Green, to water my plants while I was gone, and everything seemed fine until the day I returned home and walked into my backyard only to feel my stomach drop. My garden, the rows of vegetables, the trellises, the flowering herbs, all of it had been ripped out like a tornado had passed through. The soil was scraped flat, my handmade wooden beds destroyed, and even the irrigation system hoses were gone, as though someone had intentionally tried to erase every trace of the garden I had poured so much love into. And I was devastated, standing there in disbelief until Mrs. Green rushed over, equally horrified, and told me she had actually seen what happened. Apparently 3 days after I left, Karen showed up with 2 hired landscapers, waving some piece of paper around, and claimed that the HOA had authorized her to remove the garden since it was out of compliance. And when Mrs. Green protested, Karen told her to stay out of HOA business, then supervised as the workers tore everything down, hauling away the wood and trash bags filled with uprooted plants. And I was livid, absolutely furious, because not only had she destroyed property I had invested hundreds of dollars and months of effort into, but she had no authority whatsoever to do this. So I immediately called the HOA president, who was shocked and said they had never approved any such action, that Karen had acted entirely on her own, and encouraged me to file a police report for property destruction, which I did. But as anyone who has dealt with these situations knows, things like this can get tricky since Karen claimed she was acting under the HOA's mandate, though she had no proof. So while the police documented everything, I knew I needed more leverage, and that's when Mrs. Green suggested I look into state laws, because she remembered hearing something about new homeowner garden protection regulations that had passed recently. And sure enough, after a long night of research, I discovered that our state had enacted a Right to Garden Act just last year, specifically to stop HOAs and municipalities from banning personal gardens on residential property. And not only did it protect my right to grow vegetables, but it also had penalties for any HOA or individual who attempted to interfere with that right, including fines and liability for damages. And I realized this was my silver bullet, so I gathered all the evidence. Photos of the destroyed garden, Mrs. Green's witness statement, the HOA bylaws showing Karen had no authority, and the police report, and I filed a formal complaint with the state's Consumer Protection Division, attaching everything, and just 2 weeks later Karen got the shock of her life because the state mailed her an official notice of violation, citing her personally, not the HOA, since she acted alone without board approval, for unlawfully destroying a protected residential garden, ordering her to pay restitution for damages plus a hefty fine for violating the statute. And when I say hefty I mean several $1,000s, and apparently she froze right there in the middle of the street when she opened the letter, her face turning pale as she stammered something about misunderstanding the rules, but by then it was too late. She tried to beg the HOA board to cover her fine, but they refused since she had acted without authorization, and when she tried to claim she was just following community standards, the president bluntly told her the bylaws specifically allowed gardens, so she had no defense, and watching her crumble under the weight of her own arrogance was the most satisfying feeling I'd ever experienced. But the story didn't even end there, because she tried to retaliate by spreading rumors that I had reported her out of spite, which backfired when Mrs. Green and several other neighbors stood up at the next HOA meeting to defend me, calling Karen out for years of harassment and overreach, and the board ended up formally censuring her and stripping her of any volunteer enforcement roles, basically telling her she had no business policing anyone else's property ever again. And as for me, with the restitution money I rebuilt my garden bigger and better, adding new raised beds, a small greenhouse, and even a decorative fence with a sign that said, "Protected by state law," which made the neighbors chuckle every time they walked by, and surprisingly it brought the community closer, with other homeowners inspired to start their own little gardens, turning the block into a more vibrant, welcoming place, while Karen became a shadow of her former self, avoiding eye contact and keeping to her house, her days of strutting with a clipboard long over. And though I never intended to become some kind of poster child for standing up to HOA bullies, the whole ordeal taught me a powerful lesson about knowing your rights, documenting everything, and never letting petty tyrants think they can trample over you unchecked, because sometimes karma doesn't just come back quietly. It arrives in the form of a state-sealed envelope that makes even the loudest HOA Karen freeze on the spot and finally face the consequences of her actions.